Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for IAM Online. This is Dean Woodbeck with InCommon, and IAM Online is brought to you by InCommon and Internet 2, and also the EDUCAUSE Higher Education Information Security Council. The chat function today will be the place to post your questions, and I also posted in the chat backup audio bridge in case you're having problems with Adobe Connect. Otherwise, you'll hear the sound through Adobe Connect. So without further ado, you can see the title on your screen, Identity Access and Management with Globus, and I will introduce our moderator, Tom Barton from the University of Chicago and Internet 2.
Thanks, Dean. Hello, folks. And Steve, oh, there we go. So, kind of goes to the heart of why we have an awful lot that we do that is in common, and it's a great community effort to try to address those parts that we can together so that, we've kind of cut problems down to size that we each have to face individually. And I think this the talk on Globus today is a really good example of that for a couple of reasons that I'll kind of go into right now. So I'm going to try to wet your whistles for what Steve has queued up for us here. So I've put some points, some kind of high-level requirements of a sort of a generic problem that I expect most of us see from time to time. If not all of these requirements, then at least several of them in a given application protection scenario. Like, where do the users come from? So sometimes they're always inside of our org, sometimes they're not necessarily just inside our org, outside and inside. And if they're outside, how do we log them in and track them and so forth? It's going to be used in common, in identity federation, social IDs like Facebook and so forth, or what? Will there be a need to add two-factor on top of that plethora of means? web we're quite familiar with, but there's often mobile or command line kinds of client scenarios or thick clients even. So those are possibilities that we encounter, all of us. And then the integrations, with either through, batch, shell script kind of automation or APIs of various sorts, and the different kinds of security roles that users and sometimes the automatons need to be assigned to in managing that over a period of time. And in this case, I think also it's probably fair to say we may as well think about where there's OAuth 2 or OIDC that's supported in the application we're trying to protect in some fashion. So I imagine that some of these things are kind of familiar. We talk about them a fair amount. And so it's going to be interesting that what Steve Tukey from Chicago has to talk about with Globus also addresses a set of requirements much like this. So Steve, could you advance the next slide, please? So Steve, you might not know, and Globus, you may or may not know, but they kind of are products of what generically you might call research IT. They are there to kind of help research go. They're out of a long history of the Globus team at UChicago and Argonne National Laboratory producing solutions to scientific computing needs and everything over a couple of decades, I think, at this point, quite a while. And of course, those problem requirements that I mentioned in the previous slide, they're common to that environment as well. Maybe more so, perhaps, in some of the enterprise circumstances that some of us, I say us, meaning me and people like me, I guess. Not sure you're all like me on the call right now, but that we face more commonly. And so it's kind of interesting to set up a question about, well, geez, is this a research IT problem or an enterprise IT problem, the central IT kinds of people, what people like that deal with? And, yes, both, because those requirements are both. And even for those research instances of problems, application protection situations like that, they will generally have some kind of independence on enterprises, maybe those federated IDPs, that aspect of things at least, and perhaps some other things, maybe some attributes that have to come along to help the management of access and that kind of thing. But you might say also research, because the research IT community is dealing with this, Witness Globus and other projects kind of like that are kind of embedded within the research community. And you might say enterprise, because enterprise folks are also addressing these kinds of needs, oftentimes largely independently, which is kind of why I'm really glad that we're having this talk today. Steve, could you go forward one more slide? Thank you. So here are some things I'd kind of just like to kind of spin you towards listening for or thinking about as we go through this. What Steve's presentation is, so what kinds of problems is Globus Auth, that Steve will be showing us something about, telling us something about, really suited for? What's it meant to do? And he'll, I'm sure, have a lot to say about that. And I kind of netted out some kind of high-level speculations about, well, it's basically kind of insulating applications from a lot of things changing around it. The usual reason why a layer of indirection is often a good element of an architecture. And then how should, okay, so here is a widget that has a number of good properties. How should we use it for solving problems? What's the right operational architecture? And that will depend on many things, but it's something to think about when you listen to what Steve has to say. And then also, they've done a lot of work, some of which, or all of which perhaps, is available to us. And there's always caveats around statements like that. What would it take? Does it cost stuff? What are we talking about specifically? Standards, libraries, services, et cetera. But it's interesting to think about, well, geez, is that, going back to the common solutions, can we use some of what Globus has done to cut some of our problems down to size? And the other way around, is there anything that any of us are involved with that perhaps the Globus folks haven't already copped onto, that we might help them do what they're doing, because we're all kind of supporting the same purpose. We're trying to help our institutions, our faculty and students and so forth do their academic thing. So with that, let me kind of hand it over to Steve Tukey, my colleague at the University of Chicago. Steve, take it away, please.
All right, thanks, Tom. I assume you can hear me okay? All right, well, let's jump in. So yeah, as Tom said, this is Steve Tukey. I'm at University of Chicago and Argonne National Laboratory, and I'm one of the co-leads of the whole Globus effort along with Ian Foster here. So I thought what I'd do today is spend a few minutes here really trying to set up the problem, right? What is it that led us to Globus Auth, and what are some of the challenges we're faced with? And then I'm really going to kind of go through a whole variety of different security use cases that fall out of that and show what we did with Globus Auth to solve those use cases. Okay? So if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. I know Tom's monitoring the chat, and if there's questions, he can jump in and ask them. Mary, who's here with me, can do that as well. So let's go ahead and jump in. So first thing I'll start with, of course, is that, cloud, everywhere cloud, right? But it's really changed how software can be created and delivered to a community, right? So in Globus, right, our mission in Globus is creating research data management software for the science community, right? For universities, national labs, other government agencies, things like that, groups that want to manage their data through its whole life cycle in capturing from instruments or supercomputers to to making use of that, analysis of that, data publication, all these sorts of things. And when we, about a decade ago, went with the new version of Globus, some of you may be familiar with the Globus even back from the 90s when we started all this, but when we started down this new path of the Globus Cloud Services, we looked at the cloud space and realized there's something new and really powerful here for our community, which is rather than the traditional model of creating software and throwing it over a wall and making every scientist and research lab and research IT organization and facility install this big pile of software and operate it and use it and do all that stuff themselves, instead do this all via cloud-based mechanisms, right? Build our applications, the Globus web app, using software as a service-based approaches, but also build out all of our services, all our capabilities, our APIs in a way that can also be leveraged as cloud platform as a service. And then on top of that, we make use of cloud infrastructure. Everything we do in Globus is hosted on Amazon so that we get all the benefits of scalability and availability of our providers in that. Right, so ultimately what cloud has really done is transformed a group like us, our ability to produce some software that has really interesting capability for our community and deliver it globally, make it really easy to deploy into environments, make it super easy for administrators at universities to operate because they don't have to install and operate a bunch of software, and just basically make it available at a reasonable price to our community. And so if you're not familiar with Globus, just the 30-second version, right, is we focus on a variety of aspects of the data lifecycle. First is basic file transfer, right? I've got various systems around, be they scientific instruments, computational facilities, my lab servers, even my desktops and laptops that I need to schlep my data around from, cloud storage as well. And so I want a really easy way by which as a user I can come along and just say, here's some data at point A, put it on point B. Don't bother me, make it happen fast, securely, reliably, tell me when you're done, right? So that's what we actually started with at Globus, but very quickly realized that almost even a more common use case is sharing, where users not only just want to schlep data around amongst their own systems, but also share them, right? So I've got data sitting on my University of Chicago Research Computing Center cluster that I want to share with my colleagues at other universities. I shouldn't make them have to come get accounts at University of Chicago just to get access to this data. I should be able to point and click on a few things, magic happens, and they have access to this data. And that's really what Globus sharing is about, right? So I can come along, set permissions to particular users or groups, say give access to it. They can come along and download that data or transfer that data off to their own systems if they want to, right? So these first two are all about files, right? File transfer, file sharing. But of course, there's a lot more to data than just files. And this led us to our next piece, which is really moving more into data publication. Right, moving beyond files, also all the metadata about it, authors, creators, descriptions, what it is, things like that, assigning digital object identifiers and other persistent identifiers to it, having curated collections of data that are sort of managed and curated by somebody, and you can sort of think almost in the librarian sense, so that at various stages in the data lifecycle, there's data I want to publish. I can do that really cleanly and easily as an end user, again, without having to set up and manage all sorts of stuff. And then, of course, on the other side of that is the discovery. So once data is published, be able to come along, search for it, find data by its attributes or descriptions, and then download it, right, and make use of that for, reanalysis or extending results from another peer. And of course, doing this all as cloud services, right? All I need is a web browser or command line client to make use of it. Key part of Globus is we're not a cloud service. We're not cloud storage, right? We're not like a Dropbox. You can use any storage system you want with this, right? You use your campus storage, your cloud storage, any of this sort of stuff. And really, Globus is a management orchestration service over all of that for the research community. And then likewise, we don't want to be an identity provider, right? There's plenty of those out there. You all run these great services and I, as a University of Chicago employee, have a University of Chicago identity, so I shouldn't be requiring users to create more just to use this system, right? So we want to link into this whole identity infrastructure that our community has out here to do all this. And so that's in a nutshell what we do with Globus. And maybe just to make it just real concrete, right, I'll just kind of show you a quick scenario, right, of I'm out the globus.org website. I can hit login. It takes me out. I want to log into the Globus web application using my University of Chicago ID, and we have 200, 300 identifiers in here, or identity providers in here, also things like Google and ORCIDs and stuff like that. And I can say log in. You see it's taking me out to the University of Chicago Shibboleth server. Put in my one password here. Log in. And I'm logged into Globus, and then I can do things like move data around. I can go out to the University of Chicago Midway system, and maybe I'll move some data from there off to, I don't know, where should we take it? Let's take it off to our Black Pearl system, or better yet, just to show off the new one we've got, let's do it to Google Drive. All right, so where's my Google Drive? There we go. There's my Google Drive account. So we have connectors for local systems. Midway is a GPFS file system, standard high-performance computing file system. Of course, on the right side, it's Google Drive, right? So I can basically just take files and say, let's move a file from my Google Drive. I don't know, what should we pick here? Let's pick this badge list and transfer it over to my Midway cluster, right? Sometimes that's all Globus is about, right? And being able to also share, set permissions for people to grant access to these things, all that, we just do, right? So that's, fundamentally, this is what brought us into the space, right, and trying to do what we're trying to do. Now, beyond that, this is an example I'm going to point to even more broadly in this talk, and there's a lot of interesting example code here, is beyond our own application, we want to enable whole communities to create their own applications on top of all this, right? With Globus, we've got we've built this nice web application that any scientist can come in and use, but we've also built all this great mechanism, all these capabilities around file transfer and sharing and data publication that we want to allow other research groups, other groups building applications, web portals, things like that, to be able to build it themselves, right? To make use of this platform that we've built to more quickly and easily and reliably deliver their own services to the same research community. And so this is a site we've set up that's got a complete, what we call our sort of modern research data portal design pattern. So how do you build a web app using Globus, using modern science DMZs and data transfer nodes and all this, including a full example portal with full code, running out there. It's on GitHub that you can get access to, right? So again, just be able to use all this stuff. Right, so these are the sorts of things we're trying to enable with Globus. So if you step back then and say, okay, we got this group, we're trying to build these great web applications as well as other mobile desktop command line applications, right, for this community. One basic thing I got to do is make it really easy for people to log into these applications using this rich identity ecosystem of InCommon, of social identities like Google, things like this, right? Don't require yet another identity to do these things, right? So that's sort of challenge one that we recognize we need to solve both for ourselves as well as for this community that we're trying to enable. Second is protecting all of these communications, right? Fundamentally, what we're trying to enable is not just people building apps against our services. Yes, we want to do that, and we need to protect those communications, but also building your own services, right? So One of our poster child applications in our community that we work with is out of NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. They have this group called the Research Data Archive that is an archive of a couple petabytes worth of climate and environmental data that's been curated over about 3 decades now. They have 30,000, 40,000-ish global users who come in to their web applications, search their sites, download data. And this is the sort of group that we want to enable, right? We want to allow them to have federated login to their applications. We want to allow them to use the Globus transfer capabilities behind their web app. We want them to be able to create their own REST APIs in front of their web application so other people can automate and build apps directly against their stuff as well. And we don't want them to have to become security experts to do all that, right? And that fundamentally is what was the sort of core challenge we were faced with, is how do we do this set of things, but do it in a way that doesn't just lead to a whole other set of problems, right? And we all have been around long enough probably to know that in the security community, it's relatively easy to do things secure. It's relatively easy to do things that work and are easy. It's really hard to do things that solve both of those problems, right? That are usable by developers and users, that are friendly to what people understand, right? So in this case, the developers, they understand the web and how it works, and tools like OAuth and things like this, because that's what Google and Twitter and Facebook and everyone else out there is using, right? So being really web friendly with our approaches, right? And so this was kind of, in a nutshell, what about 3 or 4 years ago we were staring at and saying, how do we solve this, right? And ultimately, that's what led to Globus Auth. Right? So Globus Auth was a service we introduced as platform as a service, right? So it's a cloud-based service. We run it in Amazon, highly available and all that, that provides the sort of core identity and access management capabilities to developers, right? So a key thing I want to say here, right, is, again, we don't want to be an identity provider, right? We don't want to be providing usernames and passwords and managing all that, the identities behind those and stuff. Right? We want to create things that make it easy for developers to create their applications and services that leverage that whole ecosystem. Right? So really think of Globus Auth, even though, as you'll see here, it implements the OAuth protocols and stuff like this. Ultimately, it's focused on providing these developer APIs and capabilities to build these interesting apps and services. Right? And it does this by essentially acting as kind of identity proxy or a sort of service, sort of living in the middle of these various interactions between the end users, the identity providers from these various sources, the services that have their REST APIs and other even non-REST APIs that need to communicate with, applications, be they web, mobile, desktop, command line that you want to be tying into all these services, and even services calling other services, right? These use cases where an application wants to talk to the RDA service, which in turn wants to talk to the Globus services, which in turn want to talk to something else, right? And managing all of that coherently. And so that's why we describe Globus Auth as sort of this broker, this identity access management broker platform for it.
Hey, Steve, before you go on, I wonder if I could just kind of pop in one question here about all that. So, so how would you, and just a high-level way, is Globus Auth something akin to what Microsoft has in Azure, their secure token service kind of a thing? Is it of that general ilk? I mean, not that they're obviously not exactly the same kinds of capabilities, technically speaking, but
yeah, I'm not deeply familiar with STS. I mean, I know it a little bit. I think it's in the same ballpark in the sense that it's, I mean, if you phrase it from the perspective, and one of the ways that people talk about sort of this approach sometimes, as I mentioned, sort of an identity proxy, right? If you think from the perspective of a user trying to log in, me trying to log in via my University of Chicago account to some other service, Globus acts as a proxy or an intermediary in that action to both translate credentials as well as to manage authorization and things like this. And we'll talk about a lot of the more details. But I think overall, it's sort of down that path a bit as you're talking.
Okay, thanks.
Is that fair?
Yep.
So, from a standards perspective, it's all entirely based on OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, right? So if you've read the OAuth 2 spec, I imagine probably some of you actually have on this call, and most calls they haven't. But if you have, sorry, but also then you know what I'm talking about, right? Ultimately, from the OAuth 2 perspective, Globus Auth is an authorization server, right? That's sort of its role in the universe. It sort of manages a sort of core piece of sort of orchestrating these actions. So if you know the spec, it has a well-defined meaning, that's what we are. OpenID Connect, of course, adds identity management or identity login type capabilities to OAuth 2. And of course, a big advantage of that is this just works with what's out there, right? If a developer knows OAuth 2 and OIDC, they know how to use Globus Auth, right? They can use the same libraries they're using today, like the Google OAuth libraries. We also have our own Python SDK that we make available that makes it really easy from Python to do some of these things, and Jupyter notebooks for teaching these sorts of things, right? But ultimately, this is OAuth and OpenID Connect, but with some really interesting takes on it, and some interesting extensions that we've done. So all the basic stuff is just standard OAuth, but as we get into some of the more sophisticated use cases in this presentation, you'll see how we kind of extended and leveraged OAuth in some interesting ways to go well beyond what I think anybody else out there is doing with OAuth. So I'll pause there before I jump in and start. So for the rest of this talk, basically what I'm going to go through is kind of use cases and examples of Globus Auth to try and build up this set of capability of exactly what it does and how it does it. So I'll pause for a moment. Any questions, Tom, that you want to jump in with?
Well, actually, I did want to ask, while folks may be thinking of their own questions, about, you just mentioned about extensions. Does that mean that you've done kind of proprietary extensions to these open protocols, or have you done all the homework to get all that standardized, get that through the process?
No, we have not taken. So there's the extensions we've done are very modest and sort of fit within the extension frameworks of OAuth 2 and the like. But we haven't, at this point yet, taken it back through standard stuff. All of this is pretty new, and we're still debating if that's useful and what we should be doing there.
Mm-hmm. Is the appropriate IETF working group, still in operation that you would take it back to?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
The OAuth 2 spec's been around for a while. I know they've been filling out some ancillary specs around it. But yes, it's the OAuth working group at IETF.
And I see someone from NERSC posed a question about how does this work with SSH, and then second question, how about multi-factor on top of all this stuff?
So I will. Yep, I will talk about SSH a little later towards the end of the presentation and what we're doing there. The short answer is we are working on it, and we know how we're going to do it, and I'll give more little details on the SSH. MFA, yes, in that it's, to first order, we don't care, right? In that's, we today have a bunch of the identity providers that Globus Auth, sort of sits in front of, that makes that use of, support MFA, and people use it every day with systems like Blue Waters and otherwise.
And so there's, I guess, the residual question about MFA might be, if it's not native to, let's say, the authentication, the home organization authentication, at UChicago, for example, or wherever someone is logging in from, is there a way an application can signal to Globus Auth, hey, I want that? And somehow you also proxy or somehow in the middle of transacting over either getting it or saying, sorry, I couldn't do it, or something like that.
Right. So currently, no, we don't have any sort of MFA boosting capabilities in Globus Auth. Now, one of the things that we do not yet have that will be coming, that we've got roughly planned and is definitely coming down the pipe, is what we call level of assurance support to kind of communicate these sorts of things to and from services, so that services can know, where identities authenticated via MFA, and likewise services can place requirements saying I need certain types of identities with certain levels of assurance against them. So that's in the plans, but not there yet.
Oh, great. And by the way, so at some point, Steve, not on this call, it might be good for you and I and some of your team to talk about the Refeds Assurance Framework that's just about to be published. It sounds like it could be useful in connection with that.
That would be good.
Yeah. So there's another question you may see already in the chat from Nathan Doors at UW. So he was just sort of queuing up when you get to looking at the introspection and delegation. He kind of wants to zero in on some things there. So perfect. Nathan, keep your eyes out and let us know when you want to digress a little bit into that.
Yeah, I definitely have some slides that I'll get into those specific topics. So. All right, shall I push on and keep if you have more questions?
Yeah, and Mary, while you're in, as I think Steve indicated, he's got someone helping him there in the background, Mary. So Mary, you might look at what Chris Phillips just said and see about where to slide in some kind of response to his question about how this works with the OIDC for federations work.
Yep, I'm not actually familiar with that work, so
that's why Mary can just kind of read the whole thing right now and let you know.
Right,
go to it, Mary. We'll push on indeed.
So what I'm going to do now is, like I said, go through a whole series of use cases to try and make really concrete, again, what's the problems it's solving and sort of how it solves it. Right. So the first one is think login with Globus, or login via Globus is probably a better way to phrase it. But we think of this, if you think from an application developer's perspective, right?